The crowd buzzed with whispered conversations as the reality of the moment began to sink in. Daniels's face turned red with a mix of anger and panic. But just as the tension reached its peak, the young man with the phone shouted again, "This video just went live." Daniels's composure crumbled. He turned toward Marcus, his voice frantic now. "Turn off that camera," he barked, but it was too late. The video was spreading, and the truth was unraveling in real time. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity turning into resolve, as the story took a turn no one had expected. The tension was unbearable as Officer Daniels' world seemed to collapse around him. With internal affairs watching, his attempt to silence the recording only made things worse. The crowd's voices grew louder, fueled by the urgency of the situation. Marcus, still standing calmly, could feel his heart pounding, but he didn't flinch. This was bigger than just him now. It was about justice for anyone who'd ever been unfairly targeted or silenced. Officer Daniels' face twisted in frustration as he took a step toward the crowd. "This is all a setup," he shouted, his eyes darting between the internal affairs agent and Riley, who stood by, unmoving. But no one was buying it. Then, just when Daniels looked like he might lash out, the agent in plain clothes spoke again. "We've been following your every move for a while, Daniels. The evidence is clear." His words were cold, calculated, but it was clear Daniels had no way to escape this. He backed away, his body stiff, unable to hide the panic now taking over. But just as the moment seemed to settle, something completely unexpected happened. A car screeched to a halt just behind the crowd, and a woman jumped out. She was frantic, waving her hands in the air, her voice shaking. "Wait, don't arrest him. He didn't do anything." Everyone froze, looking at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" the internal affairs agent asked, narrowing his eyes. The woman's face was familiar. She had been in the park earlier, someone who had seemed like a casual bystander. But now she looked desperate. "I was there that night. I was the one who called for backup," she confessed, her voice breaking. "The video wasn't supposed to get out. He was helping me. I just couldn't let it be known. Not yet." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances as the truth began to twist once more. Daniels was part of something bigger, and the story was far from over. The mystery of who was pulling the strings behind the scenes was only just beginning. The woman's revelation stunned everyone. Officer Daniels, once again, was caught in a tangled web, and the truth had finally started to come to light. The internal affairs agent's eyes locked onto the woman as she explained her involvement, how Daniels had been covering up a much larger scandal that had plagued the department for years. It was clear now, the corruption ran deep. With the videos circulating and the evidence now undeniable, Daniels was placed under immediate investigation. The officer who had quietly been observing, Riley, stepped forward, now visibly shaken. "This ends now," she said, her voice firm. Marcus, still standing in the middle of it all, felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The injustice he had faced that day wasn't just his fight, it was everyone's. And while the road to full accountability had only just begun today, justice had found its way through the cracks. For Marcus, it was a victory, but a reminder that the fight for fairness would never be over. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon in the park, but things took a shocking turn when a black man, Marcus, found himself in an unexpected confrontation with a cop. What started as a routine encounter quickly escalated into something much worse. Officer Daniels, known around town for his overly aggressive behavior, decided to flex his authority in the most humiliating way possible. As onlookers watched in disbelief, Marcus stayed calm, even as the officer's words and actions crossed the line. But what no one saw coming was how fate had its own plans for the day. Just when it seemed like Daniels would get away with his behavior, Karma decided to make a dramatic entrance, delivering an unbelievable twist that left everyone stunned. Stick around to see how this story unfolds, because justice sometimes works in ways you'd never imagine. Marcus wasn't a stranger to moments like this. Growing up in a small town, He'd learned early on that staying composed in tense situations was the only way to survive. As Officer Daniels continued to throw his weight around, Marcus kept his hands visible and his voice steady, despite the growing crowd and the officer's escalating tone. What made it worse was the smug look on Daniels' face, as if he knew no one would question his authority. He demanded to see Marcus's ID, even though there was no reason for the stop. People whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or keep their distance. Some pulled out their phones, quietly recording the scene. What Marcus didn't know was that one of the bystanders was someone with a secret that could change everything. The pieces of this puzzle were falling into place, setting the stage for a twist no one saw coming. As Marcus stood firm, the atmosphere grew heavier. Every word from Officer Daniels felt like a dagger meant to provoke, but Marcus refused to react. Among the crowd, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter watched closely. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had seen enough to know when something didn't feel right. Her instinct told her this wasn't just a random stop, it felt personal. She subtly nudged a younger man standing beside her, urging him to keep recording. Meanwhile, Daniels continued to push. "Why are you acting nervous, huh? Got something to hide?" His voice boomed, but Marcus kept his calm. What Daniels didn't realize was that another officer had just arrived at the scene, quietly observing from a distance. This new officer, Officer Riley, had heard whispers about Daniels' reputation, but never witnessed it firsthand. The tension rippled through the crowd, with everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, a mix of concern, fear, and frustration in their expressions. Still, he stayed rooted, knowing that losing his cool would only make things worse. Daniels stepped closer, the authority in his voice growing sharper. "Hands out of your pockets," he barked, even though Marcus's hands had been at his sides the entire time. Officer Riley, standing quietly in the background, finally began to step forward. She'd seen enough to know something wasn't adding up. Her hand hovered near her radio, ready to intervene if things went further. But Daniels was too focused on his target to notice her presence. Then a voice from the crowd broke through the tension. "I've got this all on video," shouted the young man Mrs. Carter had encouraged to record. Daniels froze for a split second, his confidence shaken. The crowd murmured louder, their unease growing. As if on cue, another unexpected figure stepped out from the sidelines, a man in plain clothes who seemed to command attention without saying a word. His expression was calm but serious, and when his eyes locked on Daniels, it was clear he knew something no one else did. All eyes turned to this stranger, and the atmosphere thickened, teetering on the edge of an explosive revelation. The stranger stepped forward, his steady gaze locked on Daniels. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in energy. Daniels straightened up, trying to maintain his authority. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone sharp. The man calmly pulled out a badge. "Internal Affairs," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've been reviewing complaints about your conduct for months." The air seemed to leave Daniels' lungs as the weight of those words hit him. Marcus's eyes widened, realizing the situation was far more complicated than it appeared. Officer Riley stepped closer, her suspicion now confirmed. "I heard about this," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach Daniels. "You've been under investigation, haven't you?"